The old king is somewhere beyond the eastern frontier, far from Babylon, far from the gardens and stone courts that carry his name. Maybe he is winning. Maybe he is already dead. Behind him stretches a realm no one had seen before, from the Aegean coast to the lands near the Indus, stitched together under one crown. How does a minor vassal build something that vast, and why does a man like that keep writing until the map finally fights back? Cyrus did not inherit a world empire. He inherited a problem. He was born into a Persian house that answered to the Medes, a smaller power living under a larger one, expected to serve, tribute, and stay in line. Most rulers in that position spend their lives surviving. Cyrus spent his learning how power really worked. Because the truth was simple and dangerous. Kingdoms did not stand on gold alone. They stood on loyalty, fear, resentment, and the moment those feelings changed sides. That is why his story feels almost impossible. He did not begin with the richest city, the largest army, or the oldest throne. He began at the edge of someone else's empire, looking up. And what made him extraordinary was not just that he conquered. It was the way he understood people before he broke them. He could see that enemies were useful. Old elites were useful. Local gods, local customs, old titles, old habits, all of it was useful if it kept a province quiet. That instinct would make him great. It may also have made him believe every frontier could be managed the same way. Later writers wrapped his childhood in legend. They told stories of dreams, prophecies, a baby marked for death, and a shepherd saving the future king. Maybe some Persian listeners loved that story. Maybe Greek audiences did too. But the hard history is less theatrical and more revealing. Cyrus was almost certainly born into a real ruling line in Persis or Anshan, the son of Cambyses, heir to a Persian throne that was still subordinate. Some traditions made his mother Mandane, daughter of the Median king Astyages. That may be true, or it may be one of those politically useful family trees history likes to invent. Either way, the message is clear. Cyrus grew up close enough to power to understand it and far enough beneath it to resent the ceiling above him. He came from harsh country. Fars was no soft river kingdom. This was upland Iran, stone, dust, horse country, tribal loyalties, hard movement, and men who learned early that survival favored discipline more than comfort. When Cyrus inherited power among the Persians, probably around 559 BC, he was still a vassal in the shadow of Median supremacy. Above him sat Astyages, king of the Maids, ruler of a stronger realm, lord of Ecbatana and its wealth. On paper, the balance was obvious. The Medes ruled, the Persians obeyed. But on paper, empires always look more solid than they really are. Astyages had power, but power at the top can become brittle. If nobles are angry, if generals are humiliated, if old loyalties start to curdle, a crown can suddenly weigh nothing at all. Somewhere in that weakness, Cyrus saw his opening. Greek tradition gives us Harpagus, the wronged Median grandee, the man who supposedly carried a personal hatred of Astyages and encouraged revolt. Whether every detail of that story is true does not really matter. What matters is that matter's unity cracked. When Cyrus rebelled in the early 550s BC, he was not charging blindly at a giant. He was inviting the giant's own people to step aside. And they did. Babylonian records, which are far colder than heroic legend, still preserve the essential fact. Astyages marched against Cyrus, and Astyages' troops turned on him. That was the first miracle. Not that Cyrus won a battle, but that he made the enemy's army stop believing in the enemy. A lesser rebel would have burned the old order down. Cyrus did something smarter. He took Media and kept much of its machinery. He captured Ecbatana, the Median capital, and with it the treasury, the prestige, the habits of rule, the sense that now he was not just a tribal chief with momentum. Now he was a king of kings in the making. This is where the future empire starts to come into focus. Cyrus did not erase the Medes, he absorbed them. He let Persians and Medes stand together at the center of power, not equals in some modern sense, but partners in an imperial project. That decision changed everything. He was no longer merely the man who defeated a master. He became the man who could inherit a master's world without shattering it. And once he had done that, every neighboring ruler had to ask a terrifying question. If Persia could swallow Media, what exactly was going to stop it next? The first answer came from the west. There ruled Croesus of Lydia, one of the richest men in the ancient world, king of Sardis, master of a kingdom swollen by trade, gold, and Greek connections. Croesus looked east and saw a dangerous newcomer. He also saw opportunity. If Cyrus was still consolidating, maybe this was the moment to strike, or at least contain him, before the Persian rise hardened into something permanent. So the two powers moved toward collision. Herodotus gives the drama, omens, consultations, and famous warnings. The details are colored by storytelling, but the broad shape is real enough. Croesus and Cyrus fought in Anatolia. The campaign did not end the first time swords crossed. Croesus seems to have withdrawn toward Sardis, perhaps expecting time, allies, and winter to protect him. Cyrus did what great conquerors do when they sense hesitation. He refused to wait. That mattered because ancient war often moved with the seasons. Armies paused, kings calculated. Distance itself was a weapon. Cyrus moved as if delay were a trap. He kept the pressure on. Sardis fell in 547 or 546 BC, and with it Lydia, that rich Western monarchy whose name had practically become a synonym for wealth. One more throne gone, one more treasury added, one more political lesson delivered to the region. The lesson was brutal in its clarity. Cyrus did not merely win battles, he denied opponents the time to recover from them. After Lydia came the Greek cities of Asia Minor, not all at once, not in one tidy cinematic sequence, but by the steady extension of Persian authority to the coast. Now, the Persian state faced the Aegean world. And suddenly this former vassal from the Iranian plateau was not a regional upstart anymore. He was becoming a continental fact. Yet even here his method remained recognizable. He used force, but he also used continuity. Old local structures survived where useful. Existing elites could serve if they submitted. The point was not to turn every land into Persia. The point was to make every land work for Persia. That distinction sounds administrative. In reality, it was revolutionary. Most early kings were brilliant at taking cities, and much worse at holding strangers. Cyrus grasps that conquest was only the loud part. The quiet part was rule. Sometime after Lydia, Cyrus seems to have campaigned east as well, extending Persian authority into Central Asian regions and toward the northwestern edge of India. The evidence is thinner here, the timeline less clean, but the pattern is plain. He was building depth, not just headlines. That is one reason his empire became the first one that feels truly global for its age. It was not a chain of trophies. It was a connected imperial space, a vast zone of tribute, roads, loyalty, and fear spanning radically different peoples who had once belonged to different political worlds. Then came Babylon. And Babylon was different from everything before it. Media had been the overlord next door. Lydia had been rich and Western. Babylon was ancient prestige itself. To conquer Babylon was not just to seize another capital. It was to announce that the old centers of civilization could now be entered, judged, and ruled by a Persian king. But Babylon also came to Cyrus at the perfect moment, because Babylon under Nabonidus was troubled. The last Babylonian king had alienated important groups, especially around the cult of Marduk. Political dissatisfaction and religious frustration were already weakening the regime from within. Cyrus understood the opening. In 539 BC, Persian forces moved into Mesopotamia. At Opis, the Babylonians were defeated. Sippar fell soon after. Then Babylon itself was taken. The surviving record suggests the city surrendered with little resistance when Persian forces entered. That part matters because it shows Cyrus again choosing legitimacy over spectacle. He did not need Babylon reduced to ruins. He needed Babylon useful. The famous Cyrus cylinder, written in Babylonian style, presents him as the chosen restorer, the king welcomed by Marduk, the ruler who corrected the failures of Nabonidus. Modern people sometimes overstate that cylinder, turning it into language it never claimed for itself. It is not a modern human rights manifesto. It is royal propaganda in the political language of Babylon. But propaganda still tells you what a ruler wanted people to believe, and Cyrus wanted to be seen as the man who restored order, respected sanctuaries, and returned displaced gods to their homes. That was not softness. That was strategy at the highest level. He knew that priests, local traditions, and civic pride could either feed rebellion or bless his rule, so he recruited them. In the Hebrew Bible, he appears with astonishing favor for a foreign conqueror. The king who allows Jewish exiles to return and rebuild. That alone tells you how different his image was from the usual imperial memory. People conquered by him did not always remember only chains. Sometimes they remembered permission. With Babylon under Persian control, Cyrus had crossed a threshold no earlier ruler had crossed in quite the same way. He was now master of the ancient Near East on a scale that forced the world to think in new dimensions. This is the moment when the title becomes true, not just a conqueror, not just a king, the founder of the first world empire. And what made that empire astonishing was not only its size, but its composition. Medes, Persians, Lydians, Babylonians, Elamites, and many more peoples were not simply flattened into one identity. They were governed through a flexible imperial logic that said in effect, keep your customs, honor your gods, pay the king, and do not revolt. That formula is not sentimental. It is cold, practical, and brilliant. Cyrus understood that people will often accept foreign rule if the price of resistance is high and the terms of submission are livable. He also understood symbolism. At Pasargadae, his early capital, he built a royal center that reflected something new, Persian at its core but open to multiple artistic influences from across the empire. Even his architecture hinted at the political idea he was perfecting. Different worlds could be brought under one frame. The famous gardens there, the ordered landscapes, the palaces, the clean geometry, all of it feels like conquest translated into stone and space. He was not only taking the world, he was arranging it. And that is why Cyrus towers over so many conquerors who came after him. Plenty of rulers can smash, fewer can integrate. Plenty can terrify an enemy city, fewer can make that city productive 3 years later. Cyrus did both, and because he did, his victories did not die with the campaign season. They became a system. At the center of that system stood his own image, carefully balanced. He was a warrior, but not merely a butcher. He was a foreign ruler, but not one who had to spit on local beliefs to feel powerful. He could wear command without always needing humiliation. That made him more dangerous, not less. Because the worst enemy for neighboring kingdoms was not the savage they could rally against. It was the conqueror who arrived offering terms many subjects could live with. Think about the psychological shock of that. If your king tells you the Persians are barbarians, but the Persians arrive and reopen temples, confirm officials, and lower the heat of political chaos, whom do you obey? That is how empires spread faster than armies. Somewhere in those years, Cyrus ceased to be merely the founder of Persian power and became a model of kingship. Later generations would imagine him larger, wiser, cleaner, almost ideal. Greek writers, even when distorting him, could not ignore him. That happens only when raw success is paired with a memorable style. He looked like the future, and for a while he probably felt unstoppable. That feeling is the beginning of the danger. Because once a man has turned a vassal throne into a transcontinental empire, he starts to believe there is no political problem he cannot solve. No frontier looks final. No enemy looks fundamentally different. No map says stop. And before we ride out with him toward that last horizon, I want to pause on the question at the center of his legend. Was Cyrus great because he conquered more land than anyone before him? Or because he understood that power lasts longer when the defeated can still recognize themselves inside it? I can see both sides. If you think the real genius was military speed, political timing, and relentless expansion, say that in the comments. If you think the real genius was tolerance as strategy, turning subjects into stakeholders instead of permanent enemies, I want to hear that too. Because the answer matters for what happens next. The same instinct that built his empire may have taught him the wrong lesson about the edge of the world. By the time Cyrus looked east again, he had already humbled the richest kingdoms of his age. But empire has a cruel habit. Every victory moves the frontier farther away, and the farther it moves, the harder it becomes to believe there should be any frontier at all. This is where greatness begins to mutate into overreach. Cyrus had mastered states, capitals, treasuries, priesthoods, noble houses, and cities that wanted to survive by bargaining. The steppe did not bargain the same way. Out beyond the settled imperial core were powerful nomadic peoples, mobile, hard to pin down, living in a world where the usual grammar of conquest broke apart. You could take a capital if there was a capital. You could bribe a priesthood if there was a priesthood. But how do you permanently absorb a people whose strength is movement, whose political center is harder to seize, and whose pride is sharpened by open land? Somewhere in that eastern zone, Cyrus kept pressing. The exact sequence is not perfectly clear. Ancient sources disagree, and his final campaign lives half in history, half in legend. The most famous version comes from Herodotus. In that account, Cyrus marched against the Massagetae, a formidable people beyond the northeastern frontier ruled by Queen Tomyris. She's one of those figures history loves because she arrives already carrying myth. A queen on the steppe, facing the greatest conqueror alive, warning him away, refusing submission, standing at the far edge of empire like destiny with a bow. Whether every scene unfolded exactly as later writers describe it is another question. But the emotional truth of the story is powerful because it reveals the problem Cyrus had finally met. He could defeat kings who defended walls. He had more difficulty with an enemy who refused to think like a kingdom. Herodotus says Cyrus used cunning, leaving a camp stocked with wine and food, bait for warriors unused to such luxury. A section of the Massagetae supposedly fell into the trap. Among the captured was the son of Tomyris. The young man later died, whether by suicide in captivity or by another dark turn, and Tomyris in the story answered with fury. Now, pause there. Is every detail secure history? No. Other ancient writers give other endings. One tradition sends Cyrus to die in India. Another has him die peacefully at home. Even the place of his death is argued through fragments. But almost nobody doubted the larger point. His final years ended in the East, in danger, on campaign. And that alone tells you something profound. Even after Babylon, even after all of it, he was still riding outward. That is the flaw. Not cruelty, not madness, not drunken vanity. Expansion had become the logic of his kingship. The empire had been built by motion, and Cyrus either could not or would not believe motion should end. For men like this, stopping can feel like decay. If you are the one ruler who keeps winning by going farther, then farther starts to feel like proof of identity. The world begins to whisper the worst possible promise into your ear. Just one more frontier. Maybe Cyrus believed the Eastern campaign would be like the others. One more enemy to split. One more coalition to unsettle. One more victory to fold into the empire. Maybe he thought his genius for combining force and politics would work anywhere. But no ruler becomes great without eventually mistaking pattern for law. And so the founder of the First World Empire went into a kind of war his empire was least suited to simplify. Not a march on a ceremonial capital. Not a prestige siege, not a takeover of an old bureaucracy. A grinding contest with a mobile enemy on difficult ground, far from the symbolic centers that had always magnified his victories. If Herodotus is right, the final battle was catastrophic. The Persians fought hard, but Cyrus fell, and with him fell the man who had made the whole impossible structure thinkable in the first place. Herodotus gives the scene unforgettable bite. Tomyris, avenging her son, claims she has given Cyrus all the blood he wanted. It is an amazing ending, which is exactly why historians handle it carefully. Still, even if the speech is legend and the details are embroidered, the shape of the death feels fitting in a way legends often do. Cyrus, who had mastered the politics of cities and empires, seems to have met his end where those tools were weakest, on the outer rim, against a foe not impressed by imperial theater. He had built the greatest empire of his age by refusing limits. He may have died because he refused them one time too many. That is the tragedy hidden inside the triumph. The quality that made him rise faster than anyone around him, the conviction that every order could be broken and remade, also made it hard to accept that some frontiers cost more than they return. And yet even here, his fall is different from that of so many conquerors. His empire did not collapse in the dust around him. It held. His son Cambyses inherited a machine still powerful enough to conquer Egypt. Later, Darius would organize and refine that machine into an even more elaborate imperial structure. That endurance is one more measure of Cyrus's brilliance. He did not build a bonfire empire that blazed with one man's charisma and vanished. He built foundations. And those foundations were strong enough that even his uncertain death could not immediately shake them apart. Somewhere back in Pasargadae stood the tomb long associated with him, austere, elevated, almost severe in its simplicity. Not a mountain of vanity, not a maze of self-worship. A stone house for the man who had rearranged half the known world. Centuries later, even Alexander the Great would move through the Persian world with enough respect for Cyrus's memory to make historians remember the gesture. That is one conqueror saluting another across time. Because Cyrus did more than win. He changed the job description of empire. Before him, vast rule existed in pieces and bursts. After him, a new standard stood over the ancient world. An empire could be enormous, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and still governed without constant annihilation as the only language of control. Do not misunderstand that. Persian rule under Cyrus was still imperial rule. It demanded tribute, obedience, labor, military service, and submission. It could be ruthless when challenged. But compared with many conquerors, his method showed unusual restraint and unusual intelligence. He did not need every subject to become Persian. He needed them stable. That may be the single most modern thing about him. Not that he believed in a quiet, in any modern democratic sense, he did not. But he grasped that diversity inside an empire was not automatically weakness. Managed correctly, it was strength. That is why his reputation traveled so far and lasted so long. To the Persians, he became a founding father. To some Greeks, even hostile ones, he became impossible to dismiss. In Jewish memory, he became the foreign king who opened the road home. To later empires, whether they admitted it or not, he became a blueprint. There is also a quieter legacy in the landscape itself. Pasargadae, with its palaces, ordered gardens, and tomb, marks the beginning of a specifically Persian imperial style, one that would echo through later Achaemenid grandeur. Even the famous four-part garden tradition has roots there. The empire imagined not only as territory, but as space brought into order. That image fits him perfectly. Cyrus took fractured political worlds and made them legible to one center. He did it with cavalry and ambition, yes, but also with patience, symbolism, and a deep instinct for what conquered people could live with. That is why the phrase First World Empire belongs to him. Not because he marched the farthest in a straight line, but because he turned conquest into a durable architecture of rule. And maybe that is why his ending, however it happened, still carries a sting. The man who proved the world could be gathered under one imperial design died before he could decide where gathering should stop. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like. It tells the platform you want more rulers, more conquerors, and more lives that change the shape of the world. Subscribe if that is your kind of history. Not dry timelines, but the human decisions that turn kings into legends and legends into warnings. And tell me in the comments which ruler we should cover next. Do you want another empire builder, someone like Darius or Augustus? Or do you want a destroyer, the kind of man who could win every battle and still lose the future? Because Cyrus leaves us standing at the perfect doorway for what comes after. The empire he built was only beginning, and the next chapter belongs to the son who inherited a miracle and tried to turn it into something even larger.